This little beggar girl interrupts Millionaire's wedding and reveals shocking secret, but moments later, something terrible happens. Comment giving a score from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The scream sliced through the stifling afternoon air like a blade, echoing through the brownstone streets of Beacon Hill at precisely 3 o'clock. The middle-aged CEO, owner of one of the largest construction firms in the region, nearly dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxury condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For the past 3 weeks, that sound had been coming from the brownstone across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the sleek lines of his modern high-rise. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to his work. As someone who had amassed considerable wealth through strategic investments and relentless effort, he was accustomed to solving complex problems, but he preferred to steer clear of other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Loneliness had become his constant companion, filled only with contracts, spreadsheets, and the methodical routine he had built as a shield against any emotional entanglement. Across the street, inside the brownstone, the 4-year-old girl cowered in the corner of the kitchen, her large, frightened eyes trying to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from the whiskey she'd been drinking since noon at O'Malley's pub down the street, fixed on the child, trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," the alcoholic aunt hissed, her voice slurred by the booze. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bedtime. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop your sniveling," the woman grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get charcoal all over the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The CEO stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the brownstone. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that child's voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, the man felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His wealth had been built through calculated decisions and coldness in business, but at that moment, a spark of humanity insisted on awakening. Next door to the brownstone, the 61-year-old retired schoolteacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the CEO, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. How strange, she thought, observing the windows of the house next door, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been problematic, but since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children of Beacon Hill. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to her, and maybe it was time to get to know the little girl better. The CEO remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the tragedy with his wife. That woman was kind, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then suddenly she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the blue hills that surrounded Boston when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the backyard. Across the street, the CEO closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. His capital was secure, his businesses thrived, his assets grew consistently, but for the first time in years he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what happened beyond his own windows. Night fell over Beacon Hill, but the echo of that children's lullaby continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child suffering. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from local bakeries and the typical movement of Beacon Hill waking up to another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and carefully combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that didn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the brownstone. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The alcoholic aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's binge. "Good morning. I came to pay a courtesy visit," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "It's been so long since we had a proper chat." The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the other to step back. "And I'd very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's an adorable girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "She's sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," she insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, really," the woman replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the aunt's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the CEO watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the brownstone, a strange curiosity invaded him. The teacher finally said goodbye, but not without casting an inquisitive look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the brownstone, the aunt locked the door forcefully and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height did not allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the woman growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her large eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There she sat on the dirt and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the backyard under the hot midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the CEO's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He took his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while working. A woman who had been exemplary until she disappeared abruptly. A woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter. A girl with a specific name that he now desperately tried to remember. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child who was suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The CEO put his cell phone away and began to walk back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his former employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now 5 years later, that woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not helping his employee when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the CEO didn't step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the brownstone, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He took his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and she gestured violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the man couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His net worth was enviable, his investment funds grew monthly, but at that moment, all his fortune seemed insignificant in the face of the moral responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the CEO couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. 3 days had passed since the CEO discovered the identity of the child, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the brownstone next door. She decided to approach the situation differently. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the brownstone. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by evident burns, some still red and inflamed. The child drew in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My goodness," she whispered, her hands shaking as she held onto the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl raised her eyes and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetheart," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl looked quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing little birds." "How lovely! Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her large eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's rough voice echoed from inside the house, calling for the girl. The dread that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the teacher with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the backyard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him queasy. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine anger burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him somehow. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same city where he lived. And now this child was being hurt while he watched from his comfortable window, counting his dividends and earnings, paralyzed by his own lack of courage. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best business attire, took a tray with homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the brownstone. This time, she would not take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly irritated with the neighbor's insistence. "I already told you, it's not a good time." "I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the teacher firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it is our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom teaching had given her. The interior of the brownstone was gloomy and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a shame." "Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the gas stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but she had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything at all." The tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the woman, her eyes already shining with the familiar anger. "No, aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to call attention, don't you?" hissed the woman as the spoon heated up. "Want the neighbors to come here and ask questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone in the window and was recording again. This time he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. This child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted to be or not. All his wealth, all the assets he had accumulated, all the capital he kept in safe investments, none of that had value if he continued to be a coward. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic abuse, the businessman made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "I need your help with a sensitive situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life." That night, after the aunt fell asleep intoxicated on the living room sofa, the girl managed to go out silently into the backyard. Her new burns were stinging, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. And that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a serious expression on his face. The two men had been classmates at the university almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what is happening," said the lawyer, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You spoke about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who is taking care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked the lawyer, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child mistreatment, you need to contact the appropriate authorities immediately." "I know," replied the businessman, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. My former employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the tragedy with my wife. I never understood why, but now I realize that she was in trouble and I didn't pay attention. Now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with this woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "Does this happen every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too," replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone. "Do you want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many difficult cases, but something in the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I will contact the responsible bodies. This child needs to be removed from this house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of fear. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning hours. "How many times do I need to tell you not to mess up the walls?" shouted the woman, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a pest, a curse in this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You will be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hall. "And if I hear even a single noise, you will know a punishment that you have never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was that song that the teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the market. The retired educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the backyard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but full of a sadness that made the old lady's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the market, she went directly to the city centre, where the Child Protective Services office was located. She knew the responsible social worker well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The social worker raised her eyes from the papers she was analyzing. "Teacher, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger, my neighbor. I am sure that she is being mistreated." The woman straightened in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years in social work, she had learned to recognize when a report was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person who would make reckless accusations. "Tell me everything," she said, picking up a report form. While the teacher reported her observations on the other side of the city, the lawyer was in a similar meeting with the appropriate authorities. The prosecutor listened attentively while the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is strong evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked the lawyer, concerned. With this evidence, we can act today, replied the prosecutor. I will make the necessary contacts now. It was like that. By a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous reports arrived at the responsible bodies on the same morning. The social worker was finishing recording the teacher's report when her phone rang. I just received an urgent request for intervention in a house on Main Street, she said, looking at the teacher with surprise. It's the same house you just mentioned. Two independent sources, murmured the teacher. This confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The social worker, accompanied by 2 colleagues and a court officer, was heading to Main Street. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. His lawyer was at his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. You did the right thing, said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. I hope it's not too late, replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team that was approaching the brownstone. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the corner bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the social worker knocked on the door of the brownstone and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside exceeded even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and clear signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room at the back. There's someone here, she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door of the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her large, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. Hi, sweetheart, said the social worker, crouching down to be at the child's level. My name is Anna. We're here to help you. The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had spoken with her in the backyard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. My aunt will be upset, she whispered. You don't need to worry about that now, said the teacher, reaching out her hand to the girl. We're going to leave here, okay? And so, after 8 months of quiet suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house, where she had known only unhappiness and fear. But the story still held a twist that no one expected. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.